All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to be talking about something pretty serious and really important. We're going to be looking at sexual misconduct, especially in the context of therapy, that really special relationship between a psychotherapist and their client.
Yeah, this is something where the rules are super clear in a lot of places,
Mm-hmm.
but maybe not so clear in others. And it's something that affects a lot of people. So we're going to break down specifically what California says about this.
Right, and we've got some great material for you today, stuff pulled straight from the California Legal Code. We're talking about
Yeah.
the Business and Professions Code and the Civil Code, and we're also going to look at the Ethics Code, the guidelines that therapists are expected to follow.
Absolutely. And the main goal here is to cut through all the legalese and all the jargon and just lay out the bottom line for you. Like,
Yeah.
where exactly does California draw the line when it comes to sexual relationships in therapy, or even those tricky situations, those dual relationships that could be, well, kind of messed up?
Yeah, we want you to walk away from this knowing exactly what's considered wrong, like officially misconduct, and what could happen, like the real-life consequences for therapists who cross that line.
Exactly, because sometimes the consequences are way bigger than people think.
Okay, let's jump right in. First up, the big one, sexual relations with clients. California doesn't mess around here. The Business and Professions Code, Section 729B to be exact, gets super specific about what different kinds of, inappropriate behavior actually mean. And it's actually really important to get these definitions straight.
Oh, for sure. I mean, like the law actually defines sexual abuse as a therapist touching a client's, intimate parts in a way that's forceful or coercive.
Yeah.
So that's pretty straightforward. But
Right.
then there's sexual behavior. This one's a bit broader. It includes, yeah, inappropriate touching, but also any communication, talking, texting, whatever that's sexual in nature, whether it's with a current client or even a former one. The key here is the intention behind it. Is it for sexual arousal, gratification, exploitation, or abuse? If so, that's a big no-no.
Right. And they even make a point of saying that this definition doesn't include, like, legitimate therapy techniques.
Right, right. Like if a therapist is working with a client on sexual issues and it's done in a totally professional and therapeutic way, that's obviously different.
Totally. And then you've got sexual contact that's basically any touching of, intimate areas. And lastly, there's sexual misconduct, which is kind of a catch-all for any sexual behavior or communication that's just not okay, given that the person is a therapist. It's related to their professional role.
Yeah, you can see they're really trying to cover all the bases here.
Absolutely. And the penalties they lay out in the BNPC are pretty serious, too.
Oh, yeah.
We're talking potential jail time, huge fines, or both. And it gets even worse. Like the penalties get way more serious if the therapist has a history of this kind of thing or if they've, done something with multiple clients.
Right. It shows you how seriously they take repeat offenders and situations where, more than one person has been harmed.
Exactly. But here's what's really interesting, and this is super important for anyone listening. California doesn't just stop at criminal charges. They actually have a whole other section in the Civil Code, Section 43.93, that lets a patient or a former patient sue a therapist for any harm that was caused by sexual contact.
Oh, wow. So it's like a whole separate legal avenue.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And there are a few conditions for this, like the sexual contact had to have happened during therapy or within 2 years after therapy ended, or it was a result of what they call therapeutic deception.
Okay, I've heard of that before.
Uh,
That's where a therapist basically tries to convince a client that sexual contact is like part of the treatment, right?
Ugh, yeah, it's messed up, right? It totally preys on that vulnerability people often feel in therapy. And the law is really clear. It doesn't matter if the sexual contact happened outside of the therapist's office or, not during a scheduled appointment. None of that flies as a defense.
Right. It makes sense, though, when you think about it. Like the law recognizes that this power dynamic between a therapist and a client, it doesn't just magically disappear because you're not in the therapy room.
Absolutely. And all of this, the criminal stuff, the civil stuff, it paints a pretty clear picture of how California views this whole issue.
Yeah, they're not messing around. They're prioritizing the safety and well-being of the client no matter what.
Okay, so we've talked about legal consequences, but there's also the impact on a therapist's professional life, their career.
Oh, yeah, right, like their license and all that.
Exactly. So the Business and Professions Code, Section 2960, to be precise, lays out what they consider unprofessional conduct.
Right, like the stuff that could get you in trouble with the licensing board.
Yeah, exactly. And you guessed it, sexual abuse is right up there on the list, as is having sexual relations with a former patient within 2 years after therapy ends, and basically any other behavior that's sexual and not okay, given that the person is a therapist.
So even if it doesn't quite reach the level of criminal charges, it could still have huge professional consequences.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And the disciplinary actions from the Board of Psychology, these are outlined in Section 2960.1 of the BMPC, and they're pretty hardcore.
Like what could happen?
So if a licensed psychologist or a registered psychological associate has had sexual contact, and this is defined in another section, Section 728 of the BMPC, with a patient or even with a former patient within 2 years of therapy ending, their license is automatically revoked. Like, no ifs, ands, or buts.
Wow, so there's no chance of like getting a slap on the wrist or just being suspended for a bit.
Nope. And here's the kicker. Even an administrative law judge can't put a hold on that revocation. It's immediate.
It's like they're sending a very strong message about how unacceptable this is.
Yeah, absolutely. And the responsibility doesn't stop with the individual therapist. Healthcare facilities like hospitals or clinics, they also have a duty to report this kind of stuff.
Oh, interesting. So it's like a system-wide thing.
Yeah, exactly. If a healthcare facility gets a written complaint about a psychologist or a psychological associate who's working there, alleging sexual abuse or misconduct, they have to report it to the Board of Psychology within 15 days.
So there's no sweeping it under the rug.
Nope, not at all. And if they don't report it, they could face a massive fine. Like, we're talking up to $50,000 for each violation.
That's a huge incentive to do the right thing.
Definitely. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the legal side of things, the actual laws, but let's switch gears a bit and talk about the ethical guidelines for psychologists.
Right, because sometimes ethics goes above and beyond the law.
Exactly. And a lot of times the ethical guidelines are in line with the law, but they might go a little further in setting standards for good practice. For instance, Standard 10.05, the Ethics Code, this one flat out prohibits sexual intimacies with current clients.
Makes sense.
Right. Now, it doesn't give you a list of every single possible act, but it's generally understood to include things like sexual intercourse, fondling, even erotic hugging. And any type of communication that's meant to be sexually arousing, that's a no-go too. It's all about protecting the client, creating a safe space.
Yeah, totally. And what about former clients? Like, is there a point where it's okay?
That's where Standard 10.08 comes in.
Okay.
So it says no sexual relationships with former clients for at least 2 years after therapy ends. But, and this is important, even after those 2 years, it's only okay in, and I quote, most unusual circumstances.
Wow, so even after 2 years, it's still really frowned upon.
Big time. And in those rare cases where it might be considered okay, the psychologist has to prove that there was absolutely no exploitation. And to do that, they have to consider a whole bunch of factors.
Like what kind of factors?
So, think about how much time has passed since therapy ended, the type of therapy it was, how long it lasted, how intense it was, the reasons why therapy ended, the client's mental state, the possibility of any negative impact on the client, and even whether the therapist said or did anything during therapy that could have suggested they wanted a romantic or sexual relationship later on.
Wow, that's a pretty high bar to clear.
It is. It really shows you that even after therapy officially ends, there's still that potential for a power imbalance, that vulnerability on the client side.
It's like that therapist-client relationship, it really has a lasting impact.
For sure. Okay, so beyond direct sexual relations, the ethics code also talks about other situations, other types of dual relationships that could be problematic because of a sexual element.
Like what?
So for instance, Standard 10.6 says no to sexual relationships with anyone the therapist knows is close to a current client. Think family members, guardians, significant others.
Oh yeah, that makes sense. You don't want to create any conflicts of interest.
Exactly. And it specifically says that a therapist can't just end therapy with a client to get around this rule.
Wow, so you can't just like terminate therapy and then start dating the client's spouse.
Nope. And that highlights something really important. It's not just about protecting the client directly. It's about protecting the whole therapeutic environment.
Right, recognizing that these relationships are complex and impact more than just the two people in the room.
Absolutely. And then there's Standard 10.07. This one's pretty straightforward. No therapy for ex-lovers.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Wow.
You can't be objective if you've got that kind of history with someone.
Exactly. It just wouldn't be ethical. And Standard 7.07, this one talks about power dynamics in educational settings, like between professors and students or supervisors and supervisees.
Okay, so another potential area for like abuse of power.
Exactly. It prohibits sexual relationships between psychologists and students or supervisees who are in their department or agency, or anyone they have or might have in the future the power to evaluate. It's all about creating a professional and safe learning environment.
Yeah, that's so important. You don't want people feeling pressured or exploited, especially in those settings.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's say a client comes in and tells the therapist that they've been in a sexual relationship with another therapist. What happens then?
Oh, wow, that's a tough situation.
It is, and the law and the ethics code are pretty clear about what needs to happen. Legally, the therapist has to give the client the therapy never includes sexual behavior brochure and talk about it with them.
I've seen that brochure before. It's pretty direct, like it spells things out in no uncertain terms.
Yeah, it's a way of reinforcing that this kind of behavior is completely unacceptable.
Right, like no matter what the other therapist might have said or implied, this brochure makes it clear that it's wrong.
Exactly. And there's a mandatory reporting requirement for child abuse. So if the client is a minor, or if they were a minor when the sexual contact happened, and there's reason to think that the other therapist is still abusing minors, the therapist has to report it.
Okay, so protecting kids is the top priority. What about if the client was an adult when it happened?
That's where things get a little more tricky.
Yeah, because of confidentiality.
Exactly. In that case, the therapist can't disclose anything the client said without their permission. So it's a balancing act between protecting the client and respecting their privacy.
Wow, that's got to be a tough call for a therapist.
Yeah, it really is. Now, what about if a therapist finds out that a colleague is having a sexual relationship with a client?
Oh, that's a whole other can of worms.
It is, and ethically, it's a really tough spot. Ethical Standards 1.04 and 1.05 talk about informal resolution and reporting ethical violations. But when it comes to a colleague sleeping with a client, that's usually not something you can just work out informally.
Yeah, I mean, it's a serious breach of trust.
Big time. And remember, client confidentiality is paramount. So a therapist can't report a colleague to the licensing board or the APA ethics committee if it means revealing confidential information about a client.
So it's like protecting the client's privacy, even if it means another therapist might be getting away with something.
Yeah, it's a tough spot. And lastly, I wanted to mention that in California, the Code of Regulations, Section 1387.1 meter, requires supervisors to go over the therapy never includes sexual behavior brochure with their
Oh,
trainees.
that's interesting. So it's like they're trying to prevent this stuff from happening in the first place.
Exactly. It's all about educating future therapists about boundaries and ethical behavior from the very beginning.
Yeah, prevention is always better than intervention.
Totally. So as we wrap up here, what's the big takeaway for our listeners?
I think the bottom line is this. California is serious about protecting clients from sexual misconduct in therapy. They've got laws, they've got ethical guidelines, they've got reporting requirements, and they've got serious consequences for therapists who violate those rules.
Yeah.
It's all about creating a safe and trusting environment for people who are seeking help.
Right. And it's not just about the obvious stuff like sexual intercourse. It's about all those other situations, those dual relationships that could put a client at risk. It's about recognizing that power imbalance and making sure therapists don't abuse it.
And you know what? Thinking about how strong and clear these rules are, it makes you wonder, what does it say about the therapy relationship itself? Like how much trust is involved, how vulnerable clients can be.
It's a really interesting question.
And it makes you think, how important is it for everyone, not just therapists, but clients and the public, to understand these boundaries? It's
Yeah.
about protecting people, and that's something we should all care about.
Absolutely. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a complex and important issue.